It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Claire Coutinho, Labour peer David Blunkett, former Conservative advisor Mo Hussein and political editor of Galdem magazine Moya Lothian-McLean. Today, back in Westminster, the Prime Minister is facing anger over his government's handling of sleaze allegations.
If the team captain gets it wrong, then I think he should come and apologise to the public and to this House.
It was a mistake to conflate two issues, the individual case with the wider system and the due process that should be in place, and we regret that.
How much is too much? Labour demands answers over the outside earnings of this Conservative MP. The Health Secretary is expected to announce that frontline NHS staff in England will need to be fully jabbed. Also today, the new Housing Secretary offers hope to homeowners caught up in the cladding scandal.
Can we just pause and see if this is a necessary way of dealing with it? Because I'm still unhappy with the principle of leaseholders having to pay it all.
And when the curtain comes down on the climate summit in Glasgow, will it be seen as a success? Let's start with the story of growing anger over sleaze allegations and the Prime Minister missing from the Commons yesterday. Start with a few front pages. It's on most of them. The Times. Anger as PM skips sleaze showdown in the Commons. The Daily Mirror front page has no apology, no shame, no respect and no mask. That was on a visit to a hospital yesterday by the Prime Minister. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And The Express has this headline, "Just say sorry for the mess, Prime Minister." Let's start with that question. Should Boris Johnson apologise, Claire?
Well, what we've seen in the last week is the government admitting that it has made a mistake, which it did actually very quickly, and it's self-corrected, which I think is really important. And at the dispatch box, the minister expressed regrets. So I think in terms of the substance of the matter, they have dealt with this problem, and now we're going to pursue an appeals process on a cross-party basis, which I think is the right thing to do.
Right. And as the head of the government, the captain, as Mark Harper said yesterday, when he gets it wrong, he should come and apologise to the public and to this House. Is he right?
Well, I mean, when ministers speak at the dispatch box, they speak for the entirety of government. And actually, we saw Steve Barclay, who's CDL, who's responsible for this issue and being in charge of the Cabinet Office, quite clearly express regret for the issue and say, you know, hands up, they made a mistake.
Is it because Boris Johnson doesn't feel sorry, do you think?
Well, I mean, as I said, when, you know, Steve Barclay's saying those things at the dispatch box as CDL, he's speaking for the entirety of the government, and he's speaking for all government ministers, including the Prime Minister.
And David Blunkett, what do you think?
I think that Boris can't help himself. He just can't ever say, sorry, I got something wrong, I regret what happened. It's not difficult to say that and to mean it. But I think Sir John Major got it right at the weekend when he said the trouble with Boris and those around him is they think they are the masters now, and masters don't say sorry, they don't regret, they don't understand how other people feel. He's still likely to get away with it. That's what I find so bewildering, that people sort of say, oh, well, it's Boris, isn't it? Well, it isn't. It's the Prime Minister.
Mo, what do you think? Should Boris Johnson himself apologise?
I think it would have been better if he had done that, because you've seen the continuation of this story. We're still talking about it today, but he's also in a bit of a bind, because I think he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. If he had turned up yesterday, he would have had to answer many more questions. It probably would have got even more complicated. I don't think he would have been able to defend the position very well. So either way, he's now in a no-win situation. But the apology is really for Tory backbenchers, the people that he marched up the hill. Some of these were in red wall seats, in marginal seats, who are really upset and really humiliated. So the apology isn't a victory for the opposition, it's actually for party management. It's very, very important. Well,
listening to that, Moya, damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. What do you think? Should he apologise?
I think we should be asking for much more than an apology. What we're looking at here is a major sort of sleaze scandal. I think Keir Starmer referred to it as corruption, which I think it should be called. And I think that both the general public and Tory backbenchers alike should both be demanding much more action than a simple apology.
Right. Again, Claire, would an apology not now be a politically astute move?
Well, I think the important thing is that the government's expressed regret and sort of said
but
this is a mistake.
We're still talking about it, as Mo said. I mean, if you were advising the Prime Minister, if you were trying in some way to draw a line under it, wouldn't an apology go some way to doing that?
Well, I think personally, if you look at the substance of the matter in front of us, the really important thing is what course of action is the government pursuing. And what they've done is they, said last week they conflated an individual case with the appeals process. And I might add, actually, it was from all sides of the House yesterday, there was legitimate concerns about this appeals process. We even saw the chair of the Standards Committee, Chris Bryant, talking about the good arguments for an appeals process for MPs. And I think it's right that we've changed course of action and we're now pursuing that through a cross-party basis.
But to take your point further, Mo, we started with an egregious breach of lobbying rules, as was found for Owen Paterson, and now the government faces accusations of corruption and reverberations way beyond Westminster, as Moya has outlined.
Yeah, I mean, this is cutting through. It's not just an SW1 story. If you listen to MPs who are getting a lot of correspondence from their constituents, I think it is something that certainly the opposition parties will use against the government. Let's see how much long-term mileage there is on that. So it does need to be taken seriously.
Right. I mean, David, sleaze allegations have dogged all parties and all governments, haven't they, over decades. I mean, are you convinced that Labour's charge that Boris Johnson is leading his troops through the sewer is actually a vote-winning strategy for Labour?
I'm not sure. I think that in normal times, what has happened, multiple issues from the letting of contracts during COVID all the way through to Boris's own behaviour, actually would normally cut through, but we're not in normal times. Things that would have brought a government down don't appear to do so now. So I'm like Mo, I actually think that time will tell. Logically, it should. Logically, people out there who give Boris the benefit of the doubt on every occasion would be questioning themselves. But I hear some of the vox pops up my end of the country, and they're still saying, well, he's done pretty well, hasn't he? He's a cheeky chappy, he's a different kind of guy. And it's almost as though, Trumpian-like, he can get away with anything.
Well, maybe the biggest danger then, Claire, is going to come from within Conservative ranks. There was an awful lot of anger expressed by backbenchers yesterday in that debate. You were elected to Parliament in 2019. You're not the old guard. Let's have a listen to what one of your colleagues from your intake actually had to say. He wasn't alone. Aaron Bell was speaking in yesterday's debate on standards.
I know many of my friends within that group have endured a miserable time since last Wednesday's vote. I know many wish they had chosen to vote differently and are beating themselves up about that. But I say to them that loyalty to one's party is also an admirable trait. This place, indeed our entire political system, couldn't function without that either. But the reality is that my friends should not have been put in such an invidious position. That 109 has subsequently acquired an additional member, my honourable friend, the member for Hartlepool. And I hope she won't mind me quoting a WhatsApp message she sent to our group, given that it subsequently leaked to the press. She said, "This was a colossal misjudgment. It should not have been whipped. You should have been allowed to vote with your conscience on this." I couldn't agree more, and I hope the Treasury bench is listening.
The reference to the Treasury, by the way, there is a reference to the fact that whips are appointed to the Treasury team. I mean, Claire, the level of upset was palpable from a large cohort of Conservative MPs. How is the government going to repair that damage?
Well, look, that's my intake of MPs, and I would say, having got to know them over the last 2 years, they're incredibly dedicated, they're incredibly hard-working, they're incredibly vocational about representing their constituents.
And they're incredibly angry with Boris Johnson.
It has been a difficult week for them, but I think the really important thing is that, it's not just them saying it's been a mistake. That's exactly what government has said as well, and they have expressed regret sincerely, I think, for the challenges of the past week.
All right, one of the accusations that has been levelled is that some MPs were told they would lose out on funding for their constituencies if they didn't vote with the government on overhauling the standard system last week. Are you aware of anything like that going on, that sort of pressure, that funding was threatened to be withdrawn?
Well, look, I've spoken, as you can imagine, to a number of colleagues over the past week, and I've not heard anyone say that to me. So I think when I looked at it, it was in one newspaper, there was no quoted source for it, and I've certainly not had anyone say that to me.
Moya, you mentioned levels of corruption. Isn't there a risk, generally, for the Labour Party too, that voters, once again, a bit like the expenses scandal, will just believe all MPs have got their snouts in the trough? And it's not true.
Well, I think there's two things going on here. First of all, this isn't a one-off. The Conservative Party under Boris Johnson is trying to reshape the entire country to better protect themselves, not the general public they're elected to represent, from constituency boundaries to trying to scrap human rights rulings that go against the government. The entire parliamentary machine is currently engaged not in the service of the people they're representing, but themselves. Secondly, yes, there is a danger of that, but I also think it's something that needs to be looked at across all parties. MP salaries were initially brought in to ensure working class people could represent their communities and be paid for it. Second jobs we're seeing now are just pure greed. We've got, Geoffrey Cox, an MP and former Attorney General, earning what? Over $1 million for about a month's work with the British Virgin Islands, where he was not just representing accused government ministers against charges of drug running, money laundering and handing out COVID-19 contracts to connected people. In the middle of the pandemic, he was representing those people against charges brought by our own Foreign Office.
All right,
that to me does not make sense.
All right, well, let's have a look at that story. It's on the front page of the Daily Mail. Tory MP earns fortune for working in tax haven. Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, Claire, suggested this morning that it was for voters in Geoffrey Cox's constituency to decide whether or not this was appropriate. Would you be prepared to convince your constituents in East Surrey that by spending several weeks in the Caribbean, earning hundreds of thousands of pounds for yourself, you were serving their best interests?
Well, look, when it comes to second jobs, I think it's really important
let's just talk about this particular one, because it is on the front page of the Mail. The sort of scale of earnings of £1 million and the fact that he spent weeks away, not just from his constituency, but from the country. Do you think you could persuade your constituents that was a good idea?
Well, the reason that I was saying second jobs is if you look at the people who have second jobs, there was a BU report in 2018. There was about 100 MPs who had them. A third of them were councillors. There's many more who are nurses and doctors and authors. And I actually think some of those experiences are very valuable. So the example that I would bring up is Maria Caulfield, who's the Conservative MP for Lewis. She was moonlighting as a NHS shift worker at her weekends during the pandemic, and she's now a health minister. And I do think that is very valuable.
Right, but let's go back to Geoffrey Cox, because he's not doing any of those things. Are you comfortable with the former Attorney General and Conservative MP supposedly representing his constituents, spending weeks in the Caribbean and voting by proxy from there while the rest of us were here under semi-lockdown?
Well, look, I think all of these things are matters for standards committees. We've got very tight regulations on MPs and their business interests when it comes to politics, and I think that's quite right.
What did you think? When you saw it, then when you read the story, what was your reaction, Claire?
Well, I mean, my reaction was, I think, most people's reaction was that we need to make sure that standards committees are looking at second jobs. That's what the Speaker said we will do. It's right that those things are regularly reviewed. But the one thing I will say is that there is a sort of whiff of hypocrisy from the Labour Party on this issue, because Keir Starmer just yesterday declared about 100 hours of outside earnings, which he was earning thousands and thousands of pounds for. In 2017, he was talking to Mishcon de Reya, which is a lobbying firm, about a second job himself. So whilst I will, I think we should very carefully listen to the House and follow whatever the standards committees put forward. I'm a bit uncomfortable at taking lessons from the Labour Party on this one.
David?
Well, Mishcon de Reya actually is a law firm. It's not a lobbying firm, Claire, and you know it. Secondly, yes, there will be people, and I did it. I taught and I wrote while I was still in the Commons. But I think the combination of 140 hours a month, £1 million earning, and you're doing it from the British Virgin Islands, I mean, that's beyond credibility, isn't it? And the test is, am I able to continue doing my job when I'm doing something else? And if you can't answer that, then you shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, I think there's clearly a conflict of interest as well there. If you're working in the British Virgin Islands, representing accused government ministers against the own country that you've served as Attorney General of, we have to look at that. And that leads into the revolving door as well, where we see high-ranking members of the government and Labour, I will say, leaving their jobs in, politically influential roles and then going and joining, say, the banks, where they've been formally making regulation on it. I think there's someone from the Treasury who's at the moment trying to get approved to move to Barclays Bank.
No.
Yeah, it's not a good look, and I think it does need to be looked at in detail. But the more fundamental question is where what Dominic Raab, I think, was getting to, is it points the difference between if you're a newer MP and you're in a marginal seat, you haven't got the time to do a second job because you want to be visible in front of your constituents, you want them to vote for you again. So there may be a dividing line between MPs who are in much more safer seats, who feel they can do this. And there's also a difference between, is your second job giving political advice or buying political influence, or are you doing something else? There is a case, I think, for real-world experience to come into Parliament and not having careerist MPs, but depending on the job, that's quite an important thing to look at as well.
Right, but do you agree, Claire, with what David said? It goes beyond credulity, the situation with Geoffrey Cox.
Well, you know, I don't completely disagree with what David said, that the most important thing for MPs who are, you know, pursuing these outside interests, which I, you know, as I'll say, is people from all sides of the House are doing that, is that it's really tightly regulated, and we need to make sure that they are able to pursue their constituents' interest in the House.
Right. I mean, the thing is, where do you draw the line, David?
God knows. I mean, the line has been passed, but the complications of dealing... I mean, should MPs, backbenchers, because if you're a minister, you can't take any money from outside, and quite rightly, obviously. So for backbenchers, should they get paid for writing articles? I think so, yes. I don't see why people should do things that others would automatically get paid for outside their normal job, should not receive some remuneration. As I said earlier, it's entirely about whether people are delivering to the people who elected them. And, you know, if you're not there at the weekend, doing the advice surgery, attending local meetings, being available and visible, then you're not doing the job. And in the end, I think Mo picked up on this, I think in the end, people will revolt. I mean, there aren't such things anymore, and there haven't been for over 20 years as safe seats. So I think every MP has to ask themselves, do I want this job? And if I do, am I going to deliver? Because if they don't, then I hope that the electorate will actually turn and say, enough is enough.
Right, but do you think, as leader of the Labour Party, that Keir Starmer should ever be able to earn any money outside his job?
Well, in 2017, he wasn't leader of the Labour Party. He's been leader of the Labour Party for 18 months. And the answer is he won't, will he?
Right. So, I mean, that's where the line should be drawn. Moya, where do you think the line should be drawn? I mean, if people...
I don't know exactly where the line should be drawn, but I do think it's important to note that MPs are paid, what, 81k a year? And if that's, I think that we have to look at, is this second job, as we've talked about, delivering back to the public they represent? Is it giving them real world experience where they actually will know how much, you know, a pint of a price of milk is? I do think there's lines over such, you know, if you're writing an article, if that article is somehow lobbying for your position and politically benefits you, should you be remunerated? Charities aren't remunerated for things like that. So I think that's important to look at. But again, MPs are paid so much money. And when we talk about second jobs, a lot of people, you know, watching on the ground, they'll think of a second job as something they have to do in order to pay the rent. MPs are getting paid 81k. They can pay the rent and they have expenses. So, and I don't think the regulations are nearly as tight as we have talked about. Otherwise, there would not be all this backhanding that's going on.
Would you be a fan of tightening up the rules in terms of consultant... No, Moya, I was going to just put this to Claire, sorry. In terms of lobbying and consultancy?
Well, look, I think those rules should always be regularly reviewed. I think it's really important that the public can trust that MPs are, you know, being transparent, that they are representing their constituents' interests. And, you know, I do think that is really important. But we do have actually quite tight regulation. And if you look at comparative countries, you know, governments that we respect, Canada, Singapore, France. I mean, MPs often do have second jobs, but as I say, I think the main thing is we make sure that's very, very tightly regulated.
Let's talk about cladding. You heard it in the headlines. There's been an ongoing row for a number of years now about who should pay for the removal of dangerous cladding on apartment blocks. I'll just show you all this BBC News headline on the story. Cladding, why must flat owners pay the bills, asks Michael Gove. That's the new Levelling Up and Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, who was speaking to MPs on a select committee yesterday. Now, he has also said that plans to make leaseholders in blocks under 18 metres take out loans to pay for the work should be paused. Let's talk to Ruth Guest from the Manchester Gladiators group. We've spoken to the group before, not to you, though, Ruth. What did you make of Michael Gove's comments yesterday?
I'm reluctantly optimistic. But we've heard all this before from Robert Jenrick, from Lord Greenhow. In the end, actions speak louder than words. So I want to see something more stringent in how they're going to address it. Simply saying that they're going to pause payments for those under 18 metres, it's still not addressing the issue.
Right, so you still fear there'll be some sort of remediation costs that will fall to leaseholders, even though Michael Gove says he doesn't think in principle that it should?
Currently, that is happening. We're paying for wake-in watches. We're finding that there are compartmental issues where there's no fire barriers in properties. However, it was good to hear Michael Gove say yesterday that it was his intention to address all fire safety issues, not just the cladding.
Right. What will it mean for you and other leaseholders if the government doesn't change its plans?
Lots of people have already had to use their life savings. I think people will probably have to declare bankruptcy. And it's quite interesting how this announcement came yesterday following the Daily Mail's report that lenders are now concerned that they may go bust because of leaseholders forfeiting on their mortgages. Good timing.
Right. Well, who do you think should be paying for the remediation work to be done, Ruth?
I certainly don't think it should be leaseholders. I think government has a responsibility. They have allowed deregulation or self-regulation within the construction industry, and that needs to be addressed.
Ruth, stay with us. I'm going to open it up to the panel. Claire, who do you think should pay?
Well, I mean, the government has put forward significant money already. So it has put forward £5 billion of taxpayers' money to support leaseholders on this issue. But I read very carefully what Michael Gove was saying yesterday, and he talked about the people who are responsible for the cladding not taking enough of the responsibility. So I think it seems like he's going to look again at developers' contributions, and I think it's good that he's paused and he's taken that look. We know that Michael Gove's a very experienced cabinet minister. He approaches all of these things with rigour. And I think, from our perspective, we're also rightly focused on trying to get out the grant money that we have set out and make sure that is going towards remediation.
Well, as you say, Michael Gove, and claimed that he's very energetic. Let's listen to the former Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, because he was on the programme not very long ago and asked exactly this question about who should pay.
The choice for the government is, what is the balance between the state paying and then trying to recoup as much of that as possible from the developers through taxes and the leaseholder? At the moment, the balance is £5 billion by the state. The remainder, we don't know exactly how much that will be, but clearly multiple £billion being paid by the leaseholders. The leaseholders obviously find that extremely unfair, but the only way to fix that would be for the taxpayer to step in and massively increase that £5 billion fund. At the moment, and I've been, I fought this battle for a couple of years, the Treasury, the government is simply not willing to do that.
Right. Well, what do you say? Robert Jenrick said he fought that battle and the Treasury wasn't willing to move.
Well, I would just slightly push back on the only option is the taxpayer. I think it's quite right that we look at this again. And, Michael Gove yesterday was talking about the people who are responsible for the cladding, which wasn't the taxpayer, of course. And I would say that actually the £5 billion is a significant amount of money, of taxpayer money, which we have already put towards this.
Right. David, are you encouraged by what you've heard from Michael Gove, or do you think it's going to be all talk and in the end the Treasury will win the day?
Well, I'm one of the very few people on my side of the political divide who actually likes Michael Gove, despite some of the things he did when he was Education Secretary. I think what was really endearing about Michael was that he was asking himself the question, because he is the cabinet minister responsible. So he is speaking for the government. And I hope that having reflected to the Select Committee his thinking over the weekend, he might actually now be talking to Rishi Sunak and saying, let's sort this on behalf of those who are caught up in it. And of course the government, I mean, I don't mean that borrowing is the answer to everybody's prayers, but if leaseholders are having to borrow in order to be able to get the work done immediately and then pay it back over time, government can help with that now. And the big challenge, I think, for Michael is what's happening with people who are having the work done now,
right,
under 18 metres.
Right. I mean, we'll come back to Ruth on that in just a moment. Mo, why people watching will just think, why can't the property developers just pay the whole lot?
I think that's a fair point. I think this is, Michael Gove is a new broom in this beefed up department. He has a record of reform. I think, he has spoken about developers, this idea of value engineering, which basically means they cut costs, they put profit before safety. So I'm sure he will want to look at that. The government has put some cash towards this, but it isn't just the responsibility of taxpayers. So I'm sure the developers will be getting requests, if not more, from the government on this.
Moya, it can't just be the taxpayer, can it?
No, absolutely not. And Michael Gove, actually, I don't know why we're softening it. He was very unequivocal on this yesterday. He said he didn't know why people were being asked to pay at all, leaseholders, and that we collectively, this is a direct quote, the department, some in local government, others in the private sector, failed people at Grenfell, and there are people who were and still are in buildings where there's a significant risk. And I think it's also really important to stress that we live in a country that prizes house ownership. It prizes telling people to buy their own property. And now we've got people who've invested so much money into these properties who are discovering they're not only sort of worthless because of the cladding, they're being told they have to pay. It's been linked to a really bad rise in mental health. The people who died at Grenfell are not the only victims of this cladding crisis. I think 20% of leaseholders who've been trapped by this cladding reported they had suicidal thoughts. And cladding was said to be a significant factor in the deaths of several people who've died by suicide recently. One tragic case last year was Tom Mansell, who had 4 flats which were found to have flammable cladding. Just one of those flats would have cost Tom 50k, and his friend said afterwards it was a significant factor in his death. This is a crisis, and leaseholders should not have to cough up the cost for things they're not responsible for.
Right. I mean, Ruth, does any of that ring true for you?
Oh, it totally rings true. Where one of your guests said, government have put in 5 billion, but it's a 15 billion pound problem, which MPs are aware of. Where's that rest of that 10 billion coming from? I think government should be tackling this, take it on, sort it all out, and then go after the people who are responsible afterwards. Trying to sort out who's responsible now and getting them to pay is not working.
Well, you're in the Treasury, Claire. What do you say?
I would say that actually I think £5 billion is a lot of money to the taxpayer.
But where does the next 10 billion come from? For it?
Well, as Michael Gove has said, he's pausing and he's having a look at this. But I would just slightly, push back on the characterisation of £5 billion as not a lot of money. But I know it's a really difficult issue. I have constituents of my own who are struggling with this, and I think it's good that we've got Michael Gove at the helm in that department who can look at this again.
I mean, Ruth, you want the government to take on the rest of the bill. I mean, taxpayers borrowing to pay that £10 billion.
I don't want the government necessarily to take on the bill. I think that they should put the money forward and then try and recoup it from those responsible.
Yeah, agreed.
Right, David?
Yeah, I think that's very sensible. We've got to act now. Only government can do that. They're in a position to be able to, and then claw back the expenditure over time, because it will take over time. Even, we can have a go at developers, but if you don't want them to just simply go bust, and we don't, then you're going to have to do it over a period of time. Only government can do that.
Right. But David, there was a new tax announced on residential developers from 2022, and that would claw back £2 billion over 10 years. That could still leave a very big gap, and no one knowing, including Ruth, who is going to have to pay in the end.
Precisely. What a terrible mess.
I mean, who do you think at this point, Michael Gove said he's paused it, but no one yet knows, do they, Claire? What sort of reassurance can the government give while people are in the situation that Ruth is going through and the sorts of people that Moya has outlined?
Well, I mean, I think I'll wait to see what Michael Gove says. I think it's right he's looking at it, and I think I'll wait to see what he says and then we can have a look at that.
I think the risk is that he has raised expectations on this, and language really, really matters. So this is a shift. He wants to do something differently from his predecessor. But now that he has floated this idea, he will have to come up with the detail. And the devil is always in the detail with these things.
You could see why Mo was good at number 10, can't you? They need you back, actually.
Well, there you go. A vote of confidence for you, Mo, to go back into number 10. Ruth, a final word for you on this. As you say, you were reluctantly optimistic, I think, were the words you used at the beginning of the interview. How will you continue, you and your group, to hold Michael Gove's feet to the fire?
We'll just keep campaigning and hope for the best.
All right, Ruth, thank you very much for joining us today from Manchester Gladiators. Let's talk about COP26, the climate summit in Glasgow, and whether it's going to be judged a success. Mo, you were at the Paris summit in 2015. How does it compare?
It's very different because in Paris there was one agreement that we were trying to get everybody to sign up to. This is very much about the details of how do the different countries get there. So there isn't going to be one big bang moment. There have been some announcements that have been made. I don't think that they all add up to the level of ambition that we signed up to in Paris. There's a few days still left, but there are some issues around the climate finance target not being met, which is really, really important. We all talk about the Putin and Xi no-shows, but actually it's the vulnerable, smaller countries that are at the front line of climate change that really need help, and them being on board is going to be a mark of success for this summit, definitely.
Moya, you will know that some of the headline agreements that have been reached, the Indian Prime Minister saying that his country intends to generate half its electricity from renewables by 2030, also an agreement to reverse levels of deforestation by 2030, and a commitment by more than 90 countries to reduce methane emissions by at least 30%, again, from current levels by 2030. Does that denote success?
I don't think anything denotes success until we've seen it borne out in the real world. I think all the pledges made at COP are starting somewhere, as experts have said, and I think as most pointed out, then these deals, these pledges, let's call them what they are, they're promises, they're not actually binding, are not enough yet to keep us under 1.5 Celsius temperature rises, which is the sort of cut-off point for things getting really, really, really bad. And I also think it's quite worrying that the fossil fuel industry had the biggest delegation at COP. There was a study that came out yesterday that found that if the fossil fuel industry had been a country, then they would be the most represented at the conference, which says to me there's a lot of sort of lobbying going on. I don't think unless we see actual practical action and this stuff come into being, we can celebrate anything's success. And I don't think we will know whether it's been a success for another few years, by which time it may be too late. So we have to really do action now and stop patting ourselves on the back for making all these pledges.
Claire?
Well, I think I agree with Lord Stern, who's a climate economist, who said you shouldn't talk about success and failure, you need to talk about progress. And undoubtedly there has been, I think, quite significant progress, whether it's forest or oceans or just the number of countries who've put forward net zero targets. So when we took over the COP presidency, I think it was about a third of countries had a net zero 2050 target, and now it's 90% of the world's economy. So I think those things are important.
Mo?
I think that is a fair point, but really it's the long tail of this that matters. It isn't just what happens in these 2 weeks. It's when people go home, when the media stop focusing on COP, there's no marches. What are we doing to keep business, political, public interest alive in this agenda? Because that is a real test of this in terms of do we meet the targets that we've set ourselves.
David?
Well, I don't disagree with any of that, except perhaps three things. Firstly, I think a feeling of hopelessness doesn't help. So Greta's addressing the crowd, the blah, 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 never mind the swearing, doesn't help, because we need optimism, we need hope, and we need to carry people with them. And that's the second point. The second point is, are we really carrying people along with us in their homes about what's going to happen when their gas boilers are removed, when they're not helped to change their car? We've got to be alongside people and work with them for this long tail that Mo speaks about. And thirdly, we've actually also got to change the mindset and the mood of those with the resources, and they do include those fossil fuel companies that went to Glasgow. I have no objection to them being there if they're actually learning, listening and responding, because their future viability and profitability, as well as their moral duty, will lie in getting this right. So let's be hopeful about COP26, because there's so much misery about and people knocking everything down that in the end people will put their hands up and say, sod the lot of it.
Right, well, on that issue and taking people with you,
no, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. And what I'll particularly say is I think it is really important that the private sector is brought with us on this issue, because they're going to be a really important part of whether we can deliver this. And one of the things that I would just point out, which I thought was very, very positive, is the work that Mark Carney has done on the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, which means that about $130 trillion worth of investment assets will now be put towards good green use. I think that's very good.
do you think it's that significant, Mo?
I think it's significant, but these figures don't really mean much to people. You have to bring it back down to the personal level. And I think what's been lacking is a real education point in terms of what does net zero really mean for people and their finances and their everyday lives. I'm not sure the government has really explained that very well. It all seems quite high level, and that's the level we will need to deliver this at.
Right. Moya, just before we move on, this idea David puts about hopelessness, that sort of adding to the misery of it all in a way, the sort of Greta Thunberg stance that isn't helping. Do you agree?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm somebody who always says that you need light. People, when you vote out of fear, when you engage politically out of fear, it leads to a much darker environment. I think that's one of the reasons we are currently living such a polarised and divided nation. I think giving people hope and giving people something to fight for is much more powerful long term. I think the problem is, as Mo sort of pointed out, there's nothing on the sort of grassroots level, the public level. It's always all very high level discussions. You need to show people on the ground, what they can do, where they can put their energy. Otherwise, as David says, they will retreat into alienation, political alienation particularly, and apathy. So I think hope is so important. That was one of the reasons I went on the climate march this weekend, because I wanted to be surrounded and I wanted to be reminded of what I was fighting for. And I think what we need to do is, if the government aren't willing to do it, we need to create, tap into these grassroots climate networks that go and get that education, but also work out, how can we get this information out to the local communities about helping save the climate will mean for them, what changes they can make, but also how this will affect them in real time, and how they can help lobby.
Right. Well, the Chief Scientific Officer, Sir Patrick Vallance, has been in Glasgow. Let's have a listen to what he said.
In my view, this is a far bigger issue. So, of course, coronavirus has been devastating and it's affected people right the way across the globe, but it will settle down and it will go back to being a seasonal disease of some sort, most likely. This is something that's getting worse over a very long period, and without concerted long-term action, it will continue to get worse.
Is he right, Claire?
No, I think he's absolutely right. And, the government's put forward this net zero strategy with £30 billion behind it. But we all need to look at our behavioural change. And actually, I think Moya was right when she said we all need to sort of engage with people. I mean, I've been doing that locally. And I would say that the last thing I feel from my constituents is apathy. It's sheer enthusiasm and energy to pursue all of these things.
What, to do the sorts of things like change their boilers in however many years' time they're going to have to do that, and set out huge costs individually to make those requisite changes?
I mean, they're looking at all of these things. I think the most important thing on that is what we're trying to do is stimulate the market so that the costs of all of these things come down, so it is easier for people to change. But all of this is going to have to be pursued over the long term.
David?
I think it's different in Surrey East to Sheffield Brightside and Hillsborough. I mean, my wife and I can afford to have solar panels, a hybrid car, and to recycle dedicatingly. It's her drive that's done this, not mine. The people I used to represent, they don't have this. They don't have the resource to do it. They're fighting day on to put food on the table. They are the ones we're going to have to carry, because otherwise we'll have a Trumpian reaction. And I do fear down the line, just going back to the long tail that Mo mentioned, I do fear a reaction that will be exploited by the far right. And we really start thinking about this now.
All right, we're going to move on, because you heard Sir Patrick Vallance. He was making a comparison with the effects of coronavirus. Yesterday on the programme, we talked about making COVID vaccinations mandatory for frontline NHS workers in England. Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, will stand up fairly shortly in the House of Commons, not before the end of the programme, to announce that he will expect that. He will mandate for those NHS workers to be vaccinated by spring. David, is that the right thing to do? Is it soon enough?
Yes, I think it is. Obviously, clinicians already have to be vaccinated in relation to hepatitis. I think those who are working in the health service, and I'm a member of Unison, so I understand that the fears here will need to be helped through that period, including retraining and redeployment if they simply refuse to have the vaccine. But this is about other people's lives and not just their own.
Is it soon enough, Mo? Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary, saying it should be done right now.
I think it should be done soon as possible, really, because we know the winter is going to be tricky. It's going to be difficult. The government has been considering this for a while. And yes, there are concerns around staff shortages, and they may be reasonable about capacity, but equally, this is about people's lives. We've seen today that 11,000 people have died having contracted this in hospital. So I think next spring, in terms of government speak, could be a wide range of timings, right? So the sooner the better for this, I think.
Moya, where are you? With Sajid Javid or with Mo?
I think it's a very difficult issue, to be honest. I'm more focused on the sort of booster vaccines that they should be getting out, and the fact that Pfizer are developing an antiviral pill, which they believe will be in circulation very soon, which has been proved to cut hospitalisation rates by 89%.
Right.
So that's what I'm looking at, but I can't. I think it's a really difficult issue, and I'm reluctant to take a stance at the moment.
I mean, Claire, on the boosters, do you think that's actually working? I mean, the Prime Minister expressed concern about the number of elderly people ending up in hospital who've been double vaccinated.
Well, I mean, we've now got to about, I think it's 50% of the eligible people over 50 who've got their boosters. And we made a change yesterday, which I do actually think will be really important in speeding up the process, which means that when you get to 5 months, you can then book your booster vaccine. So I think that's very important. I would also say one of the things which has been really positive is the MHRA, which is our health regulator, has been the first regulator in the world to also approve a pill which treats symptoms, which cuts hospitalisations and deaths by about 50% as well. So all of these things, I think, we need to...
Well, I said I'd mention the story, or the line in the story on the front page of the Mirror. We have the picture here of Boris Johnson on his visit yesterday, surrounded by clinicians, medical staff. They're all wearing masks. He isn't. Why isn't he? And should he be, Claire?
Well, you know, I come from a family of NHS workers, and when I saw that picture, I saw that he had his tie tucked in, his sleeves rolled up. He clearly was following rules as had been told to him by the clinicians.
Should he be wearing a mask?
Well, I think the Trust had said that he should have worn them in clinical settings, which he did do. He did put it on for clinical settings.
Well, he was given a mask. I think we might be able to show you the pictures as he's walking along and he's given a mask. But in terms, again, of setting an example, Mo, should he be wearing a mask or not? Here he is, coming along the corridor with staff. He is handed a mask to put on. Should he be wearing one?
Yeah, I think it would have been better if he just wore one, because yet again, this is about perception, it's about the optics, if everybody else is doing it, then he should be, particularly in terms of what we're talking about and the period that we're going to see in terms of transmission and the impact on the virus. I think it would have been sensible, and we probably then wouldn't be talking about it today if he was.
Right, David, what do you think? He does put a mask on eventually.
Yeah, well, yeah, messages really do matter, signals matter. I was in a taxi in Sheffield last week persuading the driver that he should have a booster jab. I'm just holding this to show that we actually have got these, and we're moving around the building with them, because he was saying, well, I'm double jabbed, I'm fine. And I said, no, the booster jab is crucial, not just for your job and being able to carry on, but for the well-being of your passengers. Now that applies right across the board.
All right, let me just show you this. It's just come out to us now on Twitter. Heather Stewart at The Guardian. Government now plans to table a motion today to be voted on next week, unpicking last week's Patterson, that's Owen Patterson's rescue mission, dissolving the Whittingdale Committee, endorsing Standards Committee report on now ex-MP Patterson. What's your response, Claire?
Well, I think that's hardly surprising, considering we've said that that's the right course of action, and then what we're going to do now is work on this cross-party basis.
What should change? What do you want to see? Because the government was trying to have a new committee, this John Whittingdale Committee, that was going to have an inbuilt Tory majority.
Well, no, I think the thing that we were trying to change was the appeals process. And, you know, I'm a new MP. I haven't seen as many of these cases as some senior colleagues, but I think the recommendation to have this independent panel has been around for a number of years. And actually, even experienced people in the House, like I said earlier, the chair of the Standards Committee said there was good arguments for it. So I think that's the route that they're going to go down.
How far will this go to allaying anger, do you think, Mo?
I don't think it will go that far. I mean, the government has burnt a lot of political capital on this issue. This feels like parliamentary cleaning up because there's a bit of limbo now, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of rebuilding trust and rebuilding relationships.
Moya?
Oh my gosh. That's my only response to this. They have no desire to look at the deeper issues that were going on here. They merely wish to do a quick cover-up job, I think, and I think that people should be more outraged, and nothing will change unless you make that outrage known to your political representatives.
David?
Well, they could have done it tomorrow, but the Commons, unlike the Lords, isn't sitting tomorrow, so that's why it's next week.
Yeah, but do you think it'll actually go any way towards actually solving any of the issues around this?
No.
Nothing at all?
No.
OK. Well, on that note, I have to say thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. As you heard there, the Commons is going into recess, so we'll have no Politics Live for the next few days. We'll be back on Monday with the programme at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.